The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers that bathed the guests in a golden glow. Everywhere you looked, men in tailored suits and women in glittering gowns raised their glasses, their laughter echoing across the marble floors. It was a kind of place where appearances defined worth, where wealth was measured by the cut of your jacket or the shine of your shoes. And into that world of polished grandeur stepped a man who looked like he didn't belong. His jacket was worn, his boots were scuffed, and the calluses on his hands were visible even as he tucked them nervously into his pockets. His clothes bore the simple marks of labor, not luxury, while others carried designer watches. His wrist was bare. To the crowd, he looked like a farmer who had wandered into the wrong room, an intruder in a kingdom of silk and diamonds. The mocking began quietly at first. Whispers traded behind champagne glasses, eyes rolling, laughter stifled into napkins. A few guests smirked openly, nudging one another as if to say, "Look at him. What is he doing here?" Some stepped back as though his very presence might stain their gowns. Others made jokes loud enough for him to hear, disguising cruelty as humor. Yet, what none of them realized was that the man they ridiculed was not just another farmer. He was, in fact, the wealthiest man in the country, a man whose acres of fertile land and quiet empire fed millions, whose fortune far surpassed the combined wealth of many in that glittering hall. He had chosen simplicity not because he lacked riches, but because he valued humility. And in their haste to judge him by appearances, the crowd was about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The man in the worn jacket was named Samuel Turner, the guests, though most who truly knew him called everywhere him Sam. You looked. Born in a small rural village, glittering gowns, endless fields of weeding corn. Their Sam's life began far from chandeliers and marble floors. It was a kind of place where appearances defined. His parents were farmers, where wealth was measured by necessity, jacket or the tilling soil that often gave more dust. And into that world of polished grandeur stepped a man. Sam looked like he didn't belong. His jacket was worn. His boots were scuffed, filled with water. The calluses on his hands were required to coax life from stubborn nervously into his pockets. Unlike others, Sam never bore the simple marks of labor. He grew to love the soil beneath his fingernails. Others carried designer watches. The satisfaction of planting a seed and watching it grow. He looked like a farmer who had wandered into the wrong room. He was aware of how others looked at him in a kingdom of silk and diamonds. City kids, the mocking began quietly and the dirt on his boots. Whispers traded behind champagne glasses. Teachers sometimes spoke down to him, eyes rolling, his path in life laughter stifled into calloused hands and a few guests smirked openly. A farmer's son nudging one another farmers say, "Look at him." They would say, "What is he doing?" Dismissing his dreams before he had back as though his very presence what they didn't know was that Sam had a sharp mind. Others made jokes loud enough for him to hear. Detail. Disguised numbers fascinated humor. Patterns intrigued him. What none of them realized was that the man they ridiculed was not just another farmer. Like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The wealthiest man in the country saw fields as a man whose acres of fertile land and quiet empire fed millions. By the time he was 18, far surpassed the combined wealth of many. His father passed away. He had chosen Sam as the head of the household because he lacked riches. The burden could have crushed him, because he valued humility. He turned in their haste to judge him by appearances. He worked from dawn until long after sunset. They would never forget. He also studied. He read books on agriculture, economics, and trade, often by candlelight when the day's labor was done. Slowly, he began to notice ways to improve farming, rotating crops, using natural fertilizers, and conserving water. Neighbors laughed at first when they saw him experimenting with unusual techniques. "That boy is wasting his time," they said. But Sam's yields doubled, then tripled. Where others barely scraped by, Sam thrived. Within a decade, he expanded his farm, buying plot of land others had given up on. By 30, he was supplying grain not just to his county, but to entire regions. By 40, his name was whispered in government offices and corporate boardrooms, though many who discussed him had never seen his face. Despite his growing fortune, Sam never changed his ways. He still rose with the sun, still wore simple clothes, and still ate at the same wooden table his father had built decades ago. He lived without the flash of wealth because he saw wealth differently. To him, riches weren't meant for glittering suits or fancy cars. Wealth meant security for his workers, education for his children, and investments in the land that had given him everything. And yet, despite his accomplishments, Sam knew that in the eyes of society, appearance still dictated respect. If he walked into a boardroom dressed plainly, executives dismissed him. If he attended social gatherings in work boots, he was treated like a servant rather than a guest. It didn't matter that he quietly donated millions to schools, hospitals, and charities. To many, all they saw was a farmer. So when Sam stepped into that luxurious ballroom, dressed in the same clothes he wore every day, he knew exactly what would happen. He knew the stares, the whispers, the mocking would come. But he also knew something else. Sooner or later, the truth always reveals itself. And when it did, those who laughed the loudest would feel the sting of their own ignorance. As Samuel stepped further into the ballroom, the lights seemed harsher, the whispers sharper. Every detail of the grand room was designed to intimidate. The marble pillars carved with intricate patterns, the towering chandeliers dripping with crystal, the waiters gliding past in perfect rhythm carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Guests sparkled with diamonds and gold, their perfume lingering in the air like an invisible shield. And amidst it all, Samuel's presence felt to the crowd like a stain on perfection. The first snickers came from a group of young men near the bar. They nudged one another, pretending to hide their laughter behind raised glasses. One of them, wearing a suit so polished it reflected the chandelier's glow, whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Looks like the staff forgot their uniform." The remark drew chuckles, not because it was particularly witty, but because cruelty often finds easy applause. Samuel heard it, of course, but his face remained calm, his eyes scanning the room not for approval, but for meaning. As he moved toward the refreshment table, an older woman in pearls stepped back dramatically, lifting the hem of her gown, as though dirt might leap from his boots to stain her dress. Her companion leaned close and murmured something, both of them laughing behind painted lips. Samuel paused, nodded politely to them, and continued forward. He carried himself not as an intruder, but as someone who had every right to be there, which only made the mockery sting sharper to those who thrived on superficial hierarchies. The deeper into the room he went, the more obvious the disdain became. Some guests turned their backs outright. Others whispered in clusters, and a few pointed openly, their smiles cruel and unashamed. To them, Samuel was invisible in every way that mattered. Not someone worth knowing, not someone worth respecting. But Samuel wasn't there for their approval. His invitation to the gala had not been a mistake. The event was a fundraiser for agricultural development, ironically enough, and many of the companies sponsoring it were directly dependent on his business empire. Grain, produce, exports. Samuel's name was on the contracts, though not on the gossip columns. The irony that the man they ridiculed was the very backbone of their wealth was lost on them in that moment. As the night progressed, the subtle cruelty grew bolder. When Samuel reached for a glass of water, a waiter hesitated, glancing nervously at him as though serving him might violate some unspoken rule. When he tried to strike up conversation, guests offered curt nods before drifting away to more valuable company. Even the seating arrangements betrayed bias. Samuel was placed at a table near the back, far from the main stage, as though he were a footnote in a story where he was, in truth, the author. At one point, a well-dressed businessman leaned close to his colleague, his voice carrying across the table. Farmers should stick to their fields, not galas. The table erupted with restrained laughter, their forks clinking against plates as though cruelty were a form of entertainment. Samuel felt the eyes on him, waiting for a reaction, but he offered none. Instead, he straightened his back, ate quietly, and let their laughter hang in the air like smoke that would eventually choke them. What none of them saw was a quiet storm building beneath Samuel's composed surface. He was not a man easily angered, nor one to lash out without cause. But years of being underestimated had taught him the value of patience. Let them mock, he thought. The truth had a way of arriving, sharp and undeniable. And when it came, their arrogance would crumble. The master of ceremonies eventually took the stage, a charismatic man with a booming voice. He spoke of prosperity, of innovation, of the importance of supporting agriculture for the nation's future. Guests applauded at the right moments, raising their glasses in choreographed gestures of approval. Yet, not once did the speaker mention the very man whose fortune had funded countless projects, whose fields had produced the abundance they all celebrated. As the applause faded, the MC announced the highlight of the evening: recognition of key contributors. Names were read aloud, each greeted with polite claps as suited men and jeweled women walked across the stage to receive plaques and photographs. Samuel's name, unsurprisingly, was absent. Whispers rose around him again. Some guests turned to smirk, as though the omission confirmed what they already believed. He didn't belong. And then came the moment that changed everything. The MC, flipping through his notes, hesitated briefly, his expression faltering as though he had stumbled upon something unexpected. Clearing his throat, he announced, "And finally, tonight we honor the single largest contributor to this year's campaign, a man whose generosity has ensured the success of our programs across the country. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Samuel Turner." The ballroom fell silent. Forks froze midair. Whispers died instantly, and every mocking smile vanished as though swept away by an invisible hand. All eyes turned to the man they had ridiculed, the farmer in simple clothes, sitting quietly near the back. For a heartbeat, disbelief reigned. Then the realization set in. The man they had mocked as poor, out of place beneath them was in fact the wealthiest man in the room, the benefactor who had made the evening possible. The tension that had simmered all night now rose to its peak. Guests exchanged shocked glances, some flushed with embarrassment, others sinking into their chairs. The very people who had laughed the loudest now scrambled to mask their discomfort, their arrogance dissolving into shame. And as Samuel stood, his simple jacket illuminated under the chandeliers, the ballroom learned a lesson it would never forget. Wealth is not measured in clothes, nor dignity in appearances, but in the unseen strength of character. For a long, suspended moment, Samuel did not move. The MC's voice still echoed faintly in the grand hall, but the silence that followed was louder than any applause. Dozens of pairs of eyes burned into him, some wide with shock, others narrowing as though trying to reconcile what they had just heard. The man they had dismissed, mocked, and sneered at was suddenly revealed as the most important figure in the room. Samuel rose slowly from his chair. He did not rush, nor did he bow his head. He moved with the same steady rhythm he had carried all his life, the rhythm of a man who had spent decades walking fields, not carpets. His boots echoed softly against the marble floor as he made his way toward the stage. Every step felt like a mirror held up to the crowd, forcing them to see themselves, to confront the ugliness of their own assumptions. As he passed, those who had laughed the loudest only minutes before shrank into their seats, avoiding his gaze. The woman in pearls who had lifted her dress so dramatically now stared at her hands, her face flushed red. The group of businessmen who had mocked farmers sticking to their fields avoided eye contact, their forced smiles faltering. Even the waiter who had hesitated to serve him earlier now bowed his head in quiet shame. When Samuel finally reached the stage, the MC greeted him with an awkward smile, his usual booming confidence replaced by nervous hesitation. He extended a plaque engraved with Samuel's name, but Samuel barely glanced at it. The applause that followed was thin, brittle, and uneven. It was not celebration. It was guilt disguised as politeness. Samuel turned slowly to face the audience. For the first time all evening, he stood above them, not below. His clothes were the same, his boots no shinier, his hands still marked with calluses. Yet in that moment, he was transformed. No longer the subject of ridicule, but the embodiment of a truth they could no longer ignore. Though he did not speak a word, the silence was heavy with the message his presence carried. These were people who measured wealth in jewelry and status, who believed respect was bought with tailored suits. Yet here was a man whose simple jacket concealed an empire, whose humility outweighed their vanity, whose generosity had funded the very event they were celebrating. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd again, but these were not mocking. They were whispers of astonishment, of shame, of recognition. Some guests clapped louder, desperate to mask their earlier cruelty. Others leaned to one another, murmuring excuses, pretending they hadn't joined in the ridicule. But the truth lingered in the air like a stone dropped into still water, impossible to erase. Samuel accepted the plaque with a nod and stepped back, his calm demeanor unshaken. He didn't gloat. He didn't scold. He didn't need to. The humiliation belonged not to him, but to those who had underestimated him. In their rush to judge a man by his clothes, they had exposed the poverty of their own character. As he stood there, the irony became unbearable for many. These were the same people who relied on Samuel's success for their own. The very food on their tables, the grain that filled their silos, the exports that lined their profits, all traced back to the man they had ridiculed. Without him, their wealth would wither. And yet, they had mocked him for his boots, his jacket, his simplicity. The MC cleared his throat, fumbling for words, but nothing he said could soften the blow. The entire ballroom knew they had been unmasked. Their laughter, their arrogance, their shallow cruelty, all revealed for what it truly was: ignorance. Samuel turned once more to the audience, and though his lips remained silent, his eyes spoke volumes. They spoke of years of endurance, of the quiet dignity of labor, of the countless times he had been dismissed and still risen above. They carried the weight of a lesson carved deep into the marrow of his life. Greatness is not found in the trappings of wealth, but in the character that sustains it. The applause swelled again, louder this time, but it carried a different tone, not joy but desperation. They clapped as if to drown out their guilt, as if noise could erase the memory of their mockery. Yet, no matter how loud they applauded, they could not change what had already been revealed. Samuel stepped down from the stage the same way he had walked up, steady, calm, untouched by their scorn or their belated approval. He returned to his seat near the back, leaving the ballroom in a silence more deafening than any speech could have been. And in that silence, the crowd was left with the bitter taste of their own prejudice. They had mocked a man for his clothes, blind to the fact that his hands had built the wealth that sustained them. They had judged humility as weakness, only to discover it was the greatest strength in the room. For Samuel, the night was not about revenge or triumph. It was a mirror held up to society, a reminder that arrogance often hides ignorance, and that the simplest man may carry the greatest wealth of all. As Samuel returned to his seat, the weight of the ballroom silence followed him like a shadow. The air that had once buzzed with laughter and careless chatter now felt heavy, thick with regret. No one dared whisper this time. No one dared laugh. The grand chandeliers still glittered above. The violin still played softly in the corner, but the mood had shifted entirely. A truth had been unveiled, and no amount of champagne or applause could cover it. Those who had mocked him the most now wrestled with their shame. The young men at the bar no longer smirked. They exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado drained. The pearl-draped woman who had once lifted her dress from his boots now fidgeted with her necklace, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might remember her sneer. The businessman who had joked about farmers sticking to their fields stared blankly into his glass, his arrogance stripped bare. Some tried to recover, their smiles forced as they approached Samuel's table with sudden warmth. They offer handshakes, empty compliments, and thinly veiled attempts to rewrite the evening's memory. But Samuel, with his calm eyes and steady demeanor, received each gesture without bitterness or false charm. He simply nodded politely, allowing their discomfort to remain theirs alone. He had no need to expose them further. Their own actions had already done that. For the rest of the evening, Samuel stayed seated, eating his meal quietly, while the gala moved on in fractured pieces. The conversations no longer flowed with the same ease. Guests glanced his way repeatedly, as if hoping for some sign of forgiveness, some word of reassurance that their mockery could be forgotten. But Samuel owed them nothing. He had not come to prove himself, nor to seek validation. He had come because his contribution mattered, because the cause was greater than their shallow judgments. As the event drew to a close, the MC returned to the stage, his booming confidence nowhere to be found. He stumbled through his closing remarks, his words ringing hollow against the truth that still lingered. When the final applause came, it was subdued, as though the entire ballroom understood that the night would not be remembered for its glittering decor or its speeches, but for the quiet lesson taught by a man in simple clothes. When Samuel rose to leave, the crowd instinctively parted for him. The same people who had once mocked his boots now stepped aside with respect, some bowing their heads slightly as he passed. Their eyes followed him until he disappeared through the grand doors, his steady steps echoing one last time against the marble floors. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying none of the judgment or pretense that had filled the ballroom. Samuel inhaled deeply. The scent of earth and grass carried faintly on the breeze from beyond the city. This was where he belonged, not in glittering halls, not beneath chandeliers, But in the open fields that had raised him, fields that whispered truth without cruelty, in the days that followed, stories of the gala spread like wildfire. Some retold it with embarrassment, admitting how they had laughed before the reveal. Others tried to soften their part in it, claiming they had suspected he was someone important all along. But the truth clung stubbornly to every retelling. They had judged a man by his clothes, and they had been wrong. For Samuel, life continued as it always had. He rose with the dawn, worked alongside his laborers, and returned to his modest home each evening. His wealth remained vast, but his heart remained simple. Yet, something had shifted in the minds of those who had once scorned him. Slowly, invitations came bearing a different tone, not to mock, but to honor. His voice was sought in conferences, his advice requested by policymakers. Still, Samuel never sought the spotlight. He accepted only what aligned with his values, turning down praise that came without sincerity. What lingered most from that night was not Samuel's wealth or his silent triumph, but the mirror it held up to society. It exposed how easily people could mistake simplicity for insignificance, how quickly arrogance could blind them to true worth. The richest man in the country had walked among them, and they had treated him as less than human because of a jacket and a pair of boots. And that was a lesson Samuel carried with him, and the one the ballroom could never forget. That respect should never be reserved for appearances, that humility is not weakness but strength, and that the true measure of a person is never found in the shine of their clothes but in the depth of their character. The night of the gala became a story repeated for years afterward, a cautionary tale whispered among the elite, a reminder that wealth wears many faces, and the simplest among us may carry the greatest fortunes. And every time it was told, Samuel's steady walk across the ballroom, calm, unshaken, dignified, lived on as the image of truth triumphing over arrogance. Where every story matters and every voice is heard,